Kirchner. I'm going to be speaking to you today on behalf of CSE, College Sports Evaluation, about the pitching analytics cycle. We're going to go through the main cycle that I'm referring to is how we can apply pitching analytics to things like recruiting, player development, and then game management. So the cycle within that. And then there's a couple other cycles we'll get to go through as well. I'm really excited to be here today. This is my happy place. So thanks for being here, and I'm excited to dive in. Before we do, though, I'd love to go through our panelists real quick. So Dave, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, please.
I'm the founder of Triple Crown and also the founder of College Sports Eval. Idea here was to find a way to test athletes at a collegiate or youth level to help the process using sensors and subjective evaluation. So my role is more visionary and less operational. We have 22 employees in the division now. Most of them are on the tech side, meaning either mathematicians, technology people, or people sorting through the data to make decisions or predictive. So thank you.
All right. Nate, you want to introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, my name is Nate Walker, and I run Diamond Solutions, which is essentially an analytics consulting firm that helps college coaches figure out how to leverage data in all sorts of capacities, whether that be player development, in-game strategy, or recruiting.
Josh Taylor, I'm the head softball coach at Louisiana Tech University. I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Ryker Chason, assistant coach, pitching coach at Ole Miss.
Dana Sorensen. I own a couple of companies, a sports performance one and then a pitching one, and my claim to fame is getting Nate into softball, the very first person that brought him in.
I'm KJ Allister. I run ODM. Started it back in 2011 when we first tested our athletes.
And I'm Derek Allister, OnDeck softball, and I will give Dana the benefit of the doubt. She did call me and she said, you got to meet this dude. And I flew down to San Diego, and here he is, Nate Walker.
Cool. Thank you, guys. All right. So we're going to Quentin Tarantino this presentation a little bit. And we're going to dive into the really cool stuff right from the beginning, right from the top. And then we'll work backwards. We'll talk about some really cool pitching concepts that you can use to win ball games. And then we're going to figure out how we actually get the data to do that, how we build ourselves a data pipeline to be able to build cool graphics like the one that you see in front of us right now. And again, at the end of the day, how we use this pitching data to give you a competitive advantage to actually win ball games. Because at the end of the day, we know that's the ultimate goal, but also player development, recruiting the kids that fit your program, etc. So what you see in front of you right now are movement charts. And essentially what they are is a graph where we plot a pitcher's vertical break, either up or down, positive or negative, and then horizontal break, positive or negative, east or west, essentially. So before we dive in, I want to be super crystal clear that where you're looking at is not a strike zone. This is not where the ball crosses the plate. It's not crossing, say, down and out or up or in. This is how the ball is moving. So different pitch types should be moving in different ways. The pitcher is throwing a drop ball. We would expect that ball to be breaking down and therefore have negative vertical break. The pitcher is throwing a rise ball. We would love to see the break be positive and therefore be above that x-axis there. So that's what these movement charts are showing us. And now we can actually do some really cool things where we start to compare different pitchers that we have. So the graph on the left, we can see that this pitcher, all four of her pitch types, her fastball, her changeup, her curveball, and her drop ball, are all clustered really tightly together. So that means that they're all moving exactly the same way, which is not ideal because at the end of the day, a pitcher is going to be able to essentially adjust to pitches when they're all moving the same way, every single one of them within a pitcher's portfolio. If they're all moving the same way, that's easier for a hitter to adjust to, as opposed to the pitcher on the right. She's got what we call a vertical stack of her pitches where they're all doing something a little bit different. Her curveball is actually not breaking much in any direction at all. That's why it's clustered kind of right around like 0, 0 in this movement chart. Underneath it, those gray dots are her fastball. So you can see that they're breaking a little bit more than her curveball, and then underneath that, she's got a pretty nice drop ball that's breaking quite a bit, several inches, almost 10 inches down, with the change right around that same area. So now we have a pitcher with something called vertical stacking, where all of her pitches are doing something a little bit different, and that's really exciting. That's a pitcher that is ultimately going to be harder for a hitter to adjust to, and can be more effective out on the field. So again, something like this, looking at pitch charts and being able to analyze a pitcher's movement profile is super exciting, and this is like the end goal where we want to be, and we can start asking really cool questions and doing all sorts of really cool things with it, but there's a whole pipeline that we have to build to get there, and so that's what we're going to talk about today, is how to build that pipeline and then how to use this kind of really cool information in the cycle that we just talked about, recruiting, player development, and game management. So that's where we're going today. Dave, do you have any questions off the bat? Okay. So, to give us a little context for what we're going to talk about today, we're going to apply it to a case study. And the case study that we're going to be talking about several times today is actually from the 2022 Canada Cup. There was a team at the Canada Cup that beat the women's USA national team twice, using a lot of the fundamental concepts that we're going to be talking about today. So that's really cool. What we have on the graph right now, or the slide right now, are all the different pitchers that were on that particular roster, and we're going to talk about how did this collection of athletes that are all collegiate players right now, how did they go about beating the USA national team using some of these cool pitching concepts?
Okay, I'm going to jump it over to Nate real quick here. You were part of watching this, Nate. If you had to just summarize pitcher profiles here, if you looked at that list and say, was it a bunch of studs? What is it, and why did you see it work, and what was your role in executing those decisions?
Well, they were very good pitchers, but they all had something unique within them. And so I think that's the key with any time you're trying to acquire pitching to your organization is you don't want to be in the middle or the averages of everything, but you want to have at least one unique characteristic, because that allows you to have, a little bit more of a role against specific type of lineups, whether it be righties, lefties, fly balls, ground balls, slaps, etc. And so, the one dimension, the very unique one-dimensionality kind of allows you to have a little bit more options within the game to go through lineups and mitigate the second and third time through the order effect. So if you just kind of go down this list here, you have Ashley Rogers, harden up, Courtney Coppersmith, a little bit spinny from the left side, Hillenbrand, spinny, Temples, left-handed, Aaliyah Benford, down changeup, Lindsay Lopez, kind of more sweep change. So you have a lot of different weapons in which you can attack a lineup, and that just gives you more variability to mitigate those times through the orders effects and allow the hitters on the other side to never get comfortable.
Pass that down to Derek for a second. And I'd just say, Derek, you probably saw most of these ladies throw. Are these the top 5 pitchers in the United States? I'll be honest.
Yeah, well, no, I think on from what the public sees, obviously there are pitchers with greater name recognition, etc. But they're obviously quality arms, or they wouldn't be doing what they're doing. And
but you've evaluated most of these ladies at one time or another.
Some of them, yeah. And but you can't always go on name recognition or travel ball or club ball name recognition. There are a lot of great players. I just saw Montana earlier, and I remember Montana as an 8th grader walking into the dome at Rosemont, and nobody knew about her. So, it's hard, but these are quality pitchers, and obviously with the knowledge that Nate will give to whoever's calling those pitches or helping them function, I mean, that's just a incredible gift and allows a pitcher to really, in my opinion, realize her potential.
Okay, let's go to the next step and begin to look at this.
Yeah, so now we get to ask the fun question of how did that group of pitchers go about beating the USA women's national team. So they used a couple of main concepts to do it, and these concepts are ones we're going to dive into today to explain what they are and how we actually use data to implement them in your programs. So the first one is they tried to minimize the times through the order penalty. So let me take a minute and explain the times through the order penalty. Essentially, the more times the pitcher gets seen by the entire lineup, the easier it is for the hitters to adjust, right? We've all experienced that as coaches in our experience. By the time a hitter has seen a pitcher 2, 3, 4 times, if you've played the same team, several times in a series, the hitters start to understand the pitcher's arsenal. The pitcher starts to get tired, and so they're essentially not going to be, the pitcher will not be as effective by the second or the third time through the order. Now, that being said, if you have an absolute warhorse, maybe she can make it all the way through, but warhorses these days are very rare, and they're also very expensive for you as a college coach to recruit. So instead, we can find more pitchers, there's more of them, that have one really killer attribute, like Nick was talking about, that you have developed to be elite. And maybe that pitcher can make it through once, maybe twice through an order, but then it's time to switch over to someone else. So that concept of minimizing the times through the order penalty can be really powerful.
Let me stop you right there and just say,
Sure.
Ryker, when you manage a roster, how does this apply in your head? Where does it ring a bell in you moving pitchers on and off the field at Ole Miss?
It's on. Yeah, so definitely a recruiting perspective for me. Like when I go out, I'm definitely trying to find kids who have something different. Obviously, I'm looking for kids who have large vertical stacks, large separation. I want a kid who can throw rise, drop, and change. We all do. But like what you're saying and what Nate has taught me is basically you have to go out and you have to find those kids who have that one unique strong component. Like what do? They have a great rise ball? Do they have a great drop ball? Do they have great sweep? How can you couple all of those together? And how can I manage a roster? How can I put 6 pitchers together and truly use a staff? How can I find the right place in the game for each of them to help us piece together a win?
Very good. Slide it down to KJ for a minute and just say you stepped into measurement of pitchers. You were measuring athleticism, and then you started measuring pitchers. What was it you gave back to your dad in the sensor data that was different than what he was seeing with his eyes?
Well, a lot of it had to do with Nate. I was going all over the country testing organizations, and I came to him and said, what if I just collect data as pitchers? And he kind of showed me the guidelines of how to do it, how to get good data, and from there he would use that. I'd send it over to Derek with OnDeck Softball so he could then find pitchers that maybe no one heard of in these organizations. And
were there hidden gems in those numbers?
Absolutely.
Just like that list that was up against the U.S. national team.
Yeah.
There's hidden gems in the data.
Yeah,
Not in what your dad saw in his eyes. He could verify it, but you saw it in the numbers first.
Absolutely. I think that it just speaks the truth about it. What you see kind of confirms it all, and you're able to go forward with it.
And we're just talking about selection now, which would be recruitment of identification of players that you may recruit. And so let's jump back over to Josh and just let him jump in here. You were given an assignment to take a roster, and the first assignment that you did was to determine what your staff's profiles were. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, we took over a roster with pretty poor pitching numbers, and I guess it was more of identifying through the data what the one thing was each pitcher was good at and how to effectively apply that to game day management. We only had 3, so it was challenging, but we did have 3 that were different and unique and had one thing that they were good at. And Chelsea, my pitching coach, is in here, so credit to her for establishing those guidelines. But we were able to really attack hitters last year with one pitch over and over and over again, and maybe a location height different and things like that. But it was one pitch and maybe 1.5 pitches with others.
When you built their pitching profiles, Josh, did you eliminate pitches that weren't quality pitches via the sensor data?
Yes, we eliminated what they thought was a pitch, if that makes sense. We eliminated what they thought was a rise ball, but had no rise ball spin. We would eliminate what they thought was a curveball and was really a fastball, essentially. And we tried to redefine for them what that pitch really was and how to be effective with it, and then getting them to buy in on what that pitch actually was.
Send it back down to Dana here and say, Dana, from the standpoint of consulting coaches, how many of them with their naked eye can see the stuff the data's saying?
Very few. I can't. I have now, with Nate's help, I've caught a lot of pitchers, and it's really, really hard in a short, pitching is 43 feet by the time you let go of the ball, 37, 36 feet, right? The ball's spinning, if you're lucky, it's spinning 1,200 to 1,800 RPMs, it's traveling 62 miles an hour. It's not what we see on Major League Baseball when we see 3,000 RPMs and we see it from 60 feet and they're throwing 95, right? So we can all tune into a Major League Baseball broadcast and we can see some nasty, nasty movement. It's much harder in softball. So where we think our biases definitely derail us because we want that pitch to be good. We get mesmerized by trajectory and don't see movement, in particular to underneath spin pitches. So the curve, rise, screw are really harder to identify. We can all kind of see 12 to 6 rotation on.
When you say they're harder to identify, what would the data help you identify? Does it just say, gosh, that was a good curve, or do you need some help spotting that even on the report? Do the coaches need some help?
Yes, I would. I've been doing pitching, coaching and lessons for, 20 years. And there are some kids that when we put them on Rapsodo early on, I'm like, oh, crap, that rise ball drops. Right? It looks, because it's on an upward trajectory, it looks like it goes up, but it actually has sink. Or we're throwing a curveball that actually has 2 inches or 3 inches of rise, and that's what's getting the swing and miss. But we're thinking it's curving and it's sweeping, and it's really the secondary factor of the pitch. So, in my first few years with Nate, it was mesmerizing every single time. And we were in a bullpen at a camp, and we had somebody catching who was a international level catcher, caught a pitch and was like, oh, that was great. And I looked at Nate and I was like, what was that pitch? And he was like, average. Okay, next pitch, he was like, oh, that was better. And I looked at Nate and he's like, that was the same. Right, so I think we get really, really distracted by our biases and what we want to see versus what's really happening. And when you're dealing with 1, 2, 3, 4 inches of movement, that's not enough for the naked eye to just identify it and see it. And underneath spin is really hard because it's not true.
Are you sure that's not? Because I stood in the bar last night expounding the virtues of sensor data, and I met a lot of coaches that can see it with the naked eye over and over.
Sure, I bet they do.
Okay.
Yeah. Until you sit there with the technology behind you to verify what you see, it's really, really hard to identify, 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock on the underneath spin. That's really, really hard. It's easy when, 11 o'clock. We get, we've had pitchers at 11:30. Okay, that's close to backspin. That's not that hard to see if you're catching. But if you're looking at 9:30, 10 o'clock, 10:15, that's really, really hard to identify. And you're talking about a huge difference between 9:30, 10 o'clock, 10:15, 10:30, and output of ball and what it's going to do.
Hand this back to Nate now, and I'm just going to jump to the next part of Mo's thing, diversity of pitching staff. What is it that you keep saying about diversity? And we talk about diversity and everything else. Why is this so critical to have diversity of pitching profiles, Nate?
Well, you only throw from 43 feet. So when you throw from 43 feet, there's only so much time to make the ball move. So it's really important to kind of have an established vertical component within your game in order to kind of maximize that diversity checkbox in a way. And a lot of pitchers don't have kind of, they sit in the middle. And so when you sit in the middle with your movement profiles, it's really difficult to kind of, manage different types of swing planes. And, just like, there's diversity in a lineup too. So you have to kind of have diversity on the pitching side in order to counter that a little bit. And, if there's one kind of like universal truth with hitting versus pitching, is usually the second and third time through the order, penalty always wins. I mean, there's a lot of coaches in this room where I'm sure a lot of you have felt like you've had the game, then you get to the fourth inning and then it goes, not looking good right now. And that's a lot of it because there's only so much, the hitters just getting comfortable. And then from the physics point of view, there's only so much that pitcher can do in that 43 feet. So it's really easy to train for that kind of dimension that you're expecting.
So with that question, how many batters in this situation or the Japanese situation against U.S. did the normal pitcher in the cycle throw to get the diversity component to be effective? How many batters were they throwing to? Were they throwing to 12, 16, 3 innings, 2 innings, 8 outs?
With your team in Canada?
Well, with either Japan or this team that played. I just want the picture to be that this diversity is not what you think it is.
I don't understand your question.
Did they throw 4 batters? Did they throw 6 batters, each of those pitchers? Did they throw 8?
In Japan?
Japan. Take Japan against the U.S.
Oh, this past Olympics?
Yes.
Oh, that's what. Okay, gotcha. I mean, I didn't watch the game, to be honest with you, but I'm not exactly sure. So.
Okay, well, let's jump to this Canada Cup roster. Were they throwing 4 batters on average? The majority.
For your
of
team?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you had a lot of
to accomplish this diversity profile that you expound, you push.
Yeah,
that you can do that as long as that's how you recruited.
Yeah, you can't execute that strategy.
But my naked eye or your naked eye couldn't see that per se. We could guess it.
You could guess it, but it's nice to have like the objective feedback of, this is past a certain threshold, which which translate to how many outs is this threshold work, and then it's just a matter of staying disciplined to the number of outs essentially that pitcher is worth.
Are you moving them on failure or success?
You're moving them up more on success.
Wow. Okay. Go ahead, Mo.
All right. So we've essentially covered a lot of these different topics on how this particular team beat the USA women's national team at the Canada Cup. So they minimized the times through the order of penalty by essentially limiting the number of batters that those pitchers threw to. And they had a very clear idea of how many batters each pitcher would face before they got pulled. And they didn't get pulled because all of a sudden they started to fail. They got pulled because they were doing well, they did their job. Now we go on to the next person and let them fulfill their role, right? And then they were able to build a diversity within the pitching staff by how they picked the kids that came. We'll talk about that when it comes to your own recruiting with your own programs. And then finally, using each of those pitchers' skill sets, whether they're a rise ball pitcher or a drop ball pitcher, whatever, against the actual hitters that they're facing and work on those matchups. So we're going to go into all of those concepts in more detail, specifically tying it back to the actual data. How can you see it in the data to be able to implement some of this stuff? And again, ultimately give you a competitive advantage to win ball games, right? Okay, so the circle that this whole presentation is based off of is this circle right here. The fact that game management, right, you winning ball games with some really cool data at your fingertips, gets intimately affected by your recruiting as well as your player development, right? If any of those pieces of that cycle aren't given appropriate attention, then the whole cycle will fall apart, okay? And so the question is, how can you use pitching data, any type of data really, defense, hitting, but we're gonna focus on pitching today. How can you use pitching data to be able to excel in those 3 areas, right? We all know they're intimately linked, and there are some examples that are no-brainers, right? If you are a program that's killing it and you're winning conference every year and you made it to the Women's College World Series, we all know that the top talent's gonna wanna come play for you because you're a winning program, right? That's an easy one. But if you're also, say, a program that's known for developing your players and they know that I'm going to go to this program and I'm going to get better, and I'm going to learn from the brightest minds who are doing the coolest things, you're going to start getting some really cool talent that wants to work hard and wants to get to where you're asking them to get to, which is also pretty cool. But then on the recruiting side, if we just talked about, hey, that team at the Canada Cup won games by having a diverse pitching staff and finding pitchers that had one really good attribute and not average of a lot, how do you then recruit to that, right? So that you're not just recruiting the one warhorse that's throwing really hard and has good movement, but instead you're recruiting several pitchers that all have one very strong attribute that's elite, but that are different, right? If you recruit 5 kids that all have the exact same movement profile, then you're not recruiting 5 of different kids, you're recruiting 5 of the same kid, and that's not diversity, right? So then how can we use data to know which profiles are different so that you're recruiting a diverse staff, right? And then once you know that this player is elite in this attribute, how you train them, the player development piece, to be even better, to kick ass at that one particular attribute, so then you can win ball games.
How many pitchers did you run through sensor data, collegiate pitchers, this last 18 months?
1,000.
So we got 1,000 pitchers profiled at every level with sensor data.
Yeah.
Were you able to see stacks? Were you able to see movement patterns?
Yeah, it's much more common to have that cluster that we saw in that movement chart in one of those original profiles, that one on the left where all of them are clustered together. That is way more common than you would think. And then it's much rarer to have a pitcher that has that stacking and does it really well. So to Nate's point, it's easier to find a pitcher that has 1, maybe 2 really good pitches than it is to find one that's got a lot. Most of them have that cluster.
Okay.
Yep. All right. So, well, here we go. Going back to this, again, the one on the left, the cluster, is much more common. The one on the right is more ideal, what we're looking for with this stacking component.
Let's jump right there with Nate and tell me about
Sure.
this. What do you see in this chart? What does it tell you? What would we not see as laymen out here?
Well, you have 2 pitchers where one on the left here has kind of, 1, 2, 3, 4 pitches all clustered in the same area, so they're all going down and glove side, so away from a right-handed hitter. And then on the right here, you have one pitcher with a little bit more two-dimensionality. I would say that is a pitcher with more down ball components to it. Obviously, in a perfect world with true two-dimensional movement, you'd have those curveball dots a little bit higher up, but that curveball can be used as a way to protect the down ball in a way to get, to mitigate, again, that familiarity effect of just going down, down, and down.
Stop there. Familiarity factor. What is that?
It's just, if this pitcher's clearly, their best pitch is their drop ball because it has the most significant vertical component to it. And so, but it is, again, one direction. And so if you keep showing it over and over and over again, especially down, which goes into the barrel more than up because more hitters are now trying to swing with a upward swing plane, that's going to result in more contact and more, and more damaging contact. And so that curveball or those green dots, or even if that fastball velo is a little bit harder, that can work as well. Serves as a little bit of a separation effect to where you're getting that hitter off of the down, and so you can throw those the green dots, the curveball, or the fastball dots 10-15% of the time to essentially protect that down ball.
Slide it down there. Dana, grab this real quick and then slide it back to Ryker. How would you enhance that profile based on that data to make it even stronger pitcher?
The one on the right?
The one, you take either one and tell me what you'd do in development.
So the one on the right, the curveball is probably sitting somewhere in 9 o'clock range. It's probably a little bit more like a gyro spin or bullet, but it's playing off the drop ball well. So if we could see if I can get that pitcher's hand to be inside the ball a little longer and take it from 9 o'clock, 9:30 is my guess. Nate, kind of close on where I think that is, yeah. And try to get him to 10. So if we can increase that rise component, I know it's a curveball, but if I can increase the vertical component of the curveball.
What are you trying to increase? Is there like 2 inches, 6 inches, 8 inches? What are we looking for?
I think in this picture, since they're sitting at 0 or maybe 1 or 2 inches of sink, we're going to try to get them to 1 inch of rise. So now we've added an inch of separation. But when I'm doing that, I want to make sure that I'm not losing the 10 inches of the drop ball. Because if that drop ball goes to 6, 7 inches, we just took her best pitch and we made it mediocre. Right, so you have to be really, really careful when you're trying to increase that separation that you don't ruin one in the process, right? So that would be kind of what I would do with that pitcher. And then on the other one, from a movement perspective, from what I do on the biomechanics side of it, I'm going to look at her body and why it is that her arm unravels the same way on every pitch. Is she been coached more into trajectory than ball movement? Like, what is her hand doing at release? Because it's clearly getting behind the ball and producing some downspin, and what she thinks is happening isn't. So I'm going to go deeper into the mechanics of the motion on the one on the left, the one on the right. We're going to like attack one area and see
what would you use developmentally to spot that on top of the data? Would you put a high-speed camera?
If you have access to it, or honestly, like today's iPhones are really, really good. You can tell a lot from them. Get it from behind. You can kind of see how the arm unravels and where the position of the hand is going in. And then I'm going to look at how well do they create some separation from their hip and their arm. Like to me, my assumption is the pitcher on the left, that body is unraveling, not on her command, but as a result of, like, she can't get her arm into layback. So she's probably going forward as her rib cage is rotating. So I want to know, do we have a ball and socket issue that can't sit and stay there, and that's why it's going along for the ride? So I'm going to look at that from the side. I'm going to look at that from behind, put her on the table, kind of see what the range of motion is in internal and external rotation.
Very good. Ryker?
Yeah, I think with both of these pitchers or any pitcher, the first thing that I want to do is just assess. So I'm assessing patterns, mechanics, ball flight, all of those things. So then I get their movement chart and I want to understand, okay, why am I producing this? So how? So you said something like a high-speed camera. We use Insight Camera at Ole Miss. We got it this year. It's been a great tool for us. And basically what that just allows me to see, and I do this maybe without them even delivering a ball first. So before I even get their movement data, I'm like, okay, what do the patterns look like? And then I go in, okay, this is what the movement looks like. This is why. And I think what Dana, a keyword she said is like, and what I say is like, you have to preserve what they have and what they're great at. Because you can take this pitcher on the right who has this 10-inch drop ball and be like, man, like if she just had a rise ball, she would be great, right? But you can't ruin what she's great at. So you have to like continually practice and make sure that the patterns line up for her to still to be able to deliver this 10-inch drop ball. But on the same time, like how can you tap into some things, some patterns that allow to unlock the arm a little bit to get a little bit of backspin?
Hand it to Josh, and then I'm going to bounce it down to Derek and ask this question. How daunting is a head coach for all the things you have to do to tackle this, and how important is it somebody on your staff can tackle it?
If you're asking me how important it has to have,
Did you make a decision like this where it was too daunting to sort through this?
No, because I have a really good pitching coach. I don't know if that's the answer you're looking for, but
a lot of head coaches are going to try to tackle something like this.
I try to I leave my pitching coach to pitching, and I tackle everything else. So what I have to tackle isn't compared to what
Is it a
Chelsea
competitive advantage to do this?
Absolutely.
How much more would you have won or lost based on no data versus data this year? Because you're 1 year into using data, right?
Well, I mean, a lot of you relate to this, but we won or lost because of the decisions that I made. I mean, when you look at when I should have pulled a pitcher, or when I should have listened to Chelsea, or when I should have made a change, those things all always factor in, and that's the hard part. I would want to make that point kind of along with your question, is that's the hard part, is understanding it and seeing it, and then actually having enough guts to make that choice, even though you're number one sitting out there. Your number 3 is a better matchup for the next 3 hitters.
I'm going to sidetrack it to Nate real quick, and then I got Derek. Snell comes off the mound. I asked this question to you before. Why did he come off the mound and the Dodgers win? Why did he come off the mound?
You know, the Rays, who for perspective, I used to work for, have analytical pillars within their organization that they're not afraid to live and die on, and one of those is second and third time through the order effect, and that was coming to the point in the game in which that moment was coming up, and the reason why they were in that moment to begin with in the World Series, trying to get 2 more wins against the Dodgers, was because they had a really strong bullpen and a kind of pitch by committee effect. So They pulled him because they are very, very disciplined at how they incorporate data, especially in their in-game strategy. And in that moment, it cost them because Snell was throwing great at that time. But you know, it's kind of one of those things of like, how do, you know, what analytical sword do you want to die on, and they're totally okay with that decision, and that's a big reason why, you know, they got there, and they're one of the most successful.
What's their payroll versus the rest of the conference?
They usually have operating budget within around 65 million, and then the Dodgers are, like, to put in perspective, close to 250 million right now, and like Yankees, Red Sox 180, 220, you know, numbers like that.
So they're having to do something different to win. Yeah,
I mean, that's just what they have to do to be competitive. You know, if the rest of the league zigs, they zag. You know, that's how they do it. And so you know, the reason they were in that moment was because of decisions like that. But unfortunately, like, it is probability, and so there is a probability that it doesn't work. And in that high pressure, high stakes moment, it didn't work. But that doesn't mean it was the wrong decision. You know, theoretically.
Okay, send it down to Derek. Derek, you and I are both old school in this, and so how fast is it moving from your eyes as somebody that's watched more talent than anybody in America?
You mean
this
the
utilization factor right here?
The data movement?
To use data to make recruit decisions, to use data to develop, to use data to game manage.
I think, yeah, I mean, it's moving at an incredible speed. When I'm out recruiting, I no longer really trust what I'm looking at. I might see things that I like, but until I check their numbers and get it confirmed, I'm not really sold on it. You know, and so often, and I was thinking about this, so often in games we go out and watch kids play, and maybe the catcher or the pitching coach isn't really calling the right pitches for that kid. And so the kid's getting lit up a little bit, when if you changed it up and you really had something, some solid data that showed where that kid should be pitching, you might have a different pitcher. I'm going to throw this down to Nate, and he can just talk about a young lady out in the Northwest who was thrown into games consistently and asked to throw a pitch which was one of her worst pitches. And she conferred with Nate, the family conferred with Nate, and it turned her pitching life around. So you remember her, right, Nate? Kid out of the Northwest. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just a lot of the times, like, a good example. You see this a lot in high school kids, is there's a lot of pressure to throw 6 pitches when really, you know, one's only good, and that affects kind of the performance level of how they do, especially as it relates to swing and miss. So a good example of what Derek was just mentioning is there was a kid that I think you know, was trying to be an up ball pitcher, but was really more of a down ball based movement profile, and you know, kept trying to throw, you know, rise curve even though the ball was sinking technically, and you know, increase the drop ball usage, and you know, swing and miss goes up, performance goes up, and then you end up getting a, you know, scholarship because of it, because your just overall performance is showing better. And so, like, a good example of that would be if you had this chart on this right here, and that pitcher was throwing primarily, you know, curveballs, even though, like, you know, her better pitch is the drop. So if those usage numbers are missing.
How often does that happen, where you show up and
lot.
Somebody's throwing something that really doesn't work over and over?
A lot, and so that's really where it's, you know, you talk about recruiting.
Collegiately too?
Yeah. I mean, but on the recruiting side, like, visually, that makes it difficult for you guys as coaches to evaluate that, because you're evaluating their B-level, you know, attributes. But it's also an advantage if you have the data, because if you see that there's an A-level characteristic that's being hidden, not many other people are going to see that. And so that's where you can get what I call surplus value in the recruiting market, to where you can get, you know, someone who was maybe a little bit underappreciated because of the results, but really is projected to do much better. And that's something, you know, you mentioned the Rays, that we were really good at, is because we would actually hope our potential draft picks would do terrible, because we thought we would have, you know, a competitive advantage by having this information, you know, to steal, you know, high-level talent that other people weren't seeing.
Cool.
Go ahead.
So, in regards to
Oh yeah. I mean, different pitch profiles do better in certain parts of the zone, for sure. So, like, let's just pretend, I don't know if this is a righty or a lefty, but if this was a right-handed pitcher, the graph on the right, that's what I call a little bit more of like a horizontal neutral repertoire, right? Like all the dots are either on the line or slightly arm side. Like that would be better. You know, the majority of that pitcher's pitches have to be arm side because the ball's going that way and it's going away from the barrel. If you have like the pitcher on the left here, like you can see those dots are more towards the -5. So that means the glove side location is going to be paramount for her to have success. Where you run into trouble is if you cannot command the direction in which the ball goes towards, you're tying your hands a lot just because you're not going to your strength, you know, more than your weaker side. So yeah, to your point, like once you get that assessment, you know, and understand kind of how your pitches move, then you can decide what, you know, at what parts of the zone in which they perform best.
If you said this was one building block, meaning best pitch analysis to your stack, does it lead to another question from you? Like you saw that, what's your next question, Nate, that you see when you see that? Yeah, you saw that chart right there. What's the next question you want to answer?
Well, I mean, I'm looking at also the velocity spreads. So like if for instance, that curveball right there is, let's say this pitcher, the down is 63 and that curveball is 60, which is quite normal. Anytime you throw an up ball pitch, sometimes it's usually 2 to 3 miles an hour slower than the down ball pitch. What I got to be careful of in terms of sequencing and advising people is I want to make sure I'm not, you know, speeding up people's bats in the top of the zone, you know, with a slight upspin, you know, in that regard. So it's still below a threshold. So that's where you can maybe move down the ladder and say, is that fastball harder than that drop? Sometimes they are. That's why I think fastballs are still a really important pitch in softball, where you could maybe elevate that fastball instead of going to that curveball because it's a little bit slower. So, you know, the velocity spreads is probably what I would look at next, but I'm basically trying to, you know, figure out how, you know, at what parts of, you know, how to maximize usage numbers given the movement strength of the pitcher while accounting for kind of like the velocity spreads within all the pitches.
Okay, let's move forward here. Go ahead.
That is correct. Yeah, and most curveballs do not curve in softball. It's very difficult to get horizontal movement in softball from an underhand slot at 43 feet. So I usually view curveballs more as another rise ball pitch, and so it's really curve, rise, screw. It's like how do you get a vertical component within your repertoire? It can be one of those three, but in this case, yes, that even if it's lefty or righty, it's not curving a lot.
I just want to make super clear one thing. If you're throwing a pitch in different parts of the zone, the movement profile isn't going to change. So for instance, the curveballs, the change-ups on that graph on the right that are all going down, even if she throws that change-up high in the zone, it's still going to be dropping. So you're not going to suddenly see, because she's throwing it up in the zone, that it now has rise. It's still going to plot in the exact same spot on that movement chart, regardless of where in the zone it goes.
Yeah, I think that would be like to continue to answer your question. Yeah. So just because she throws this fastball in different parts of the zone doesn't mean that it spins any differently. So this movement plot is not plotting where the pitch actually went. Rapsodo does have a feature that plots both the movement plot and a feature that plots where the ball actually wound up. But what you'll see a lot is like fastball is just a label. Like fastball is labeled as a pitch. If I asked any of you to turn your arm in a circle and deliver a pitch, that would be your fastball. We would all be different. We would all have a different neutral. Some of you would have top spin, some bullet, some backspin. So when you say fastball, I see kids all the time. I'm like, hey, can you throw your fastball up in the zone? And it may come out as backspin. Like, can you unravel your fastball down in the zone? May come out as a drop ball. So fastball is very much just a label. All pitches are just a label. This is truly charting like what is the spin direction and plotting it. It doesn't plot exactly where it goes to. I mean, and I've seen kids. I had a kid with me at Ole Miss. She had one thing. It was like down and across sweep, and she threw it to multiple different zones, and it worked out for her because there is still a piece of our game that does revolve around location that you can still get hitters out with.
Cool. So we just talked about vertical separation of pitches, and it's ideal to have something like the chart on the right. But then Dave was leading us so nicely into this next component, which is still a very large component of all of this, which is just straight up velocity, right? So at the end of the day, You can have a pitcher with very minimal movement but throws hard enough and she will be successful to an extent at the collegiate level, right? Vice versa, you can have a pitcher that maybe doesn't have a ton of velo, but she has strong movement, maybe on one of her pitches, that 10-inch drop ball, she can be successful at certain levels. So the certain levels part is where we can do some really cool things. So Dave mentioned this already at CSE. We have done a ton of legwork to go around and measure collegiate athletes. So we measured 1,000 pitchers last year and this year. And we did it at all different levels. So we went to Power 5s, we went to mid-major D1s, we went to D2s, D3s, NAIAs, JUCO 1s, JUCO 2, JUCO 3. We did it all. And that was super intentional because we wanted to understand what a pitcher looks like in each of those levels and how those pitchers differ on all these different metrics that we're talking about. Sometimes they differ quite a lot. Velocity is one of those. Sometimes there are some metrics where they don't actually differ that much, and so we get to ask some really cool questions on which metrics, again, change depending on these different divisions. So what we would do is after we gathered all that data together, then we grouped it into 4 buckets. So we put all the Power 5s together and then the top of mid-major D1 into a bucket, call that bucket 1. We put the top of mid-major D1s up there because we know that there are some very high-level mid-major D1s that can compete with some Power 5s and be competitive, right? So they belong in a bubble together in a bucket. And then we came with another bucket that was the rest of mid-major D1s. And then the upper D2s, they're all competitive within the same realm, so we put them together in a bucket. And then we have the rest of D2, D3, upper half of NAIA, they're all in a bucket. And then bucket 4 on this chart is the bottom of NAIA and JUCO 2, JUCO 3s. And then JUCO 1s is actually scattered all through there, depending on the school. So we group them into buckets, and then we can start doing some cool data analytics, things like what is the median fastball velocity in each of those buckets. So you can see bucket 1, which is the royal blue, all the way on the left, the median fastball velocity was 62.4 miles per hour. And that's hundreds of collegiate fastballs that we looked at to get that number. So that's interesting for several reasons. One, it gives you as a coach a really good baseline on, again, what's average for your division, and maybe Power 5s and mid-major D1s. I was a little surprised. I figured that number would be higher, and it's actually not. But on the box and whisker plot, basically like the top part of that royal blue box up to that really high bar up there, that's the top 25%. Like, yes, there are kids that are throwing from, say, 65 up to 70, and that's what everyone sees on TV, and that's what all the kids in America think they have to be throwing in order to be successful at the collegiate level, and that's not true. We've been able to show that you can be successful in college. There are college athletes right now that are throwing 55 miles an hour. They're not going to be a Power 5, but they could be D2, D3, somewhere in there, okay? So this gives context to you as a coach on where your pitchers are at. But then it also gives, the youth athletes context on where they're at, where they should be shooting for. But then we can start doing this kind of analytics on all kinds of metrics, not just velocity, right? But going back to the original concept here, like at the end of the day, if you want a pitcher that doesn't have a ton of movement but is still going to get outs based on velocity, now you can start seeing how hard they need to be throwing in order to do that. And that answer changes depending on the division that you're at, right? Or they can have average velocity, but then they better have a cool movement profile to balance that out.
KJ, do you see this model playing out in what you're testing as well?
Yeah, I think, working with youth players.
What do they think they're supposed to be throwing? When you give them a number out loud or they look at it, are they disappointed? Are they excited? Did their run and start, radar gun throw that was 65 that they put on Facebook and you gave them a 57 on Rapsoda? What happens?
They're always disappointed. But I think a lot of them you know, they'll hit 65 maybe once in their life, and they don't realize that they can't throw that every single time. You know, I'm a golfer. I can't hit a driver 330 every single time. But if I can hit it 290, I'm in a good spot. So if you hit 65 maybe once or twice, but you're consistently at 63, you're in a good spot. And I think that's where a lot of youth players don't realize that you have to find that sweet spot of you're not peaking high and throwing that every single time, but you're throwing a certain number consistently with good spin.
Okay. Derek, when you're running all your combines and evaluations, how does speed factor in? How important is speed still in the formula?
Well, I think it's very important. I think you have to have velocity, you have to have command, you have to have proper spin. You know, Nate and I have talked about Cat, and Cat had lower velocity, tremendous spin, tremendous command. So I think it all goes together. You don't really want one. I've seen pitchers throwing at 68, 69 get lit up because the ball's flat, and everybody knows when it's a strike and everybody knows when it's a ball.
But is this still an entry-level point that needs to be met? If I'm a Division I coach and I'm recruiting, do I need a verified 64 before I show up?
No,
Okay.
no, absolutely not. Kristen Schmidt, I'm dating myself there, but that girl could spin it like crazy. So, you know, you have many different ways to win in this game, and
Okay.
but I think baselines are important, Dave. I think they're very, very important, and I think this data is very, very key.
So I would say if you're mathematician or statistically, what's the plus or minus on this on validity based on your survey size mode?
The sample size matters a ton. So if you're trying to calculate something like this with 20 pitchers, you're not doing yourself any favors. You have to have a large enough sample size in order to do it correctly.
Okay. Okay, let's move on.
Okay. All right, so we've talked about vertical stacking. We've talked about velocity. The next piece is, this is a term that Dave coined the other day, velocity stacking. So essentially what we mean by this is, if you can imagine a tunnel going to the catcher where there are several different pitches that are all delivered exactly the same way, so there's no tell in how the pitcher's delivering it, and it looks exactly the same coming into the hitter, but then there's different levels of velocity on each of those pitches. In this example, we'll have a drop ball that's coming in maybe at 62, then we have an off speed that's maybe coming in at 58, and then we have a changeup that's maybe coming in at 47, right? But they all look the same coming into the hitter. That's super disruptive for the hitter, right? It's really hard for them to identify which pitch it is coming in, as long as the delivery and the look is identical. And then their timing's all messed up because these three pitches are all coming in at different points. And so then you start getting poor contact, swings and misses, and all kinds of things.
So let's let Nate run that a little bit on this velocity differential with identical looks. And what does it do to people, and what's your interpretation? And can you see it in the data?
Well, it's extremely important in softball because 5 of the 6 pitches are usually within 2 miles an hour of one another. So the change of speed is paramount, and you can usually see, if you can do it effectively and do it deceptively, especially with your windup, you can take maybe a fringe average or a slightly above average movement profile, and it can outperform its projection based on the quality of the change of speed. So yeah, it's a very important characteristic, just because of the fact that 5 of the 6 traditional pitches are usually within the same velo range, as opposed to like a baseball pitcher where it's very easy to get 3 speeds just by throwing 3 different pitch types. So it's very high on my list in terms of game-changing characteristics, and if executed properly, it can turn a fringe average or slightly above average repertoire into it can upgrade it.
Okay.
Because you have the 3 right there. So everyone always says change up from a fastball maybe is 7-mile-an-hour drop. Different people do different things. But real from a drop ball to an off speed, what is that
What's the separation points? What's he asking?
It kind of depends on your top and velo. So if you're asking of like what's the threshold for 3 speeds, generally in my experience, 3 speeds works most effectively when you're at that higher end velo range because you have the most room to go down, right? So usually you don't see an effective 3-speed pitcher unless you're above 65, because where you run the risk of is if they're lower, is throwing a slightly worse version of another pitch at a slightly less velocity level, which goes into their bat speed essentially. So, but to answer you, like numerically, to answer your question, let's just, we put off speed and changeup in the same bucket. I like the 10 to 12 mile an hour range off of like your primary hard pitch. I usually don't like changeups greater than a 15 mile an hour velocity differential.
Why?
Well, it's too slow usually, and typically they're flip changes, and flip changes are thrown with, a completely different spin profile and a higher, generally when you flip a ball up, you're artificially increasing the spin rate, and so you're giving 2 tells to the hitter. Essentially, 1, it's very slow, 2, it's different shape, 3, it's a very much higher spin rate. So it becomes a very easy pitch to identify early in the process, leaves the tunnel early, however you want to call it. But, so you can be too slow in those things, and it's also depending on the shape.
Okay, let's jump to the next slide and then hand it down to Dana. Go ahead and go forward with this.
Yeah. All right. So concept 3, velocity stacking. Concept 4 is command. Derek, you hit this one on the head. So at the end of the day, if a pitcher's throwing hard, great, but if she can't throw a strike, she's not going to be doing you guys any service in the ball game. And we all know that there's a difference between throwing a strike down the middle versus throwing one, on the edge, versus throwing a believable ball versus a ball that is unbelievable, right? So those are inches that differentiate all of those different categories, and it's really important for your pitchers to be able to command all of those different types of categories of pitches. And so at the end of the day, this is something that we take into account as still being super important. And then
it shows in the data.
Oh yeah, totally. So what we're looking at here is simply a location map of this pitcher's pitches. So we can see exactly where it crosses a plate. We can see if it's a strike, again, down the middle, if it's, somewhere on hitting a corner, if it's just outside the strike zone, but again, a believable ball, or if it's something that's in the dirt and it's, no hitter's going to be swinging at that.
Let me jump to Dana on this one. In your experience, and I know there's seasoned coaches in here, how fixable is lack of command of zone?
Little complicated because it has a lot to do with mechanics. From a development standpoint, this is the third pillar I'm going to focus on, because if the best pitchers, in my experience at D1, will throw their stuff in the strike zone and beat hitters. They'll throw a vertical component in that strike zone and beat hitters. So if you can own the strike zone with going up, down, change speeds, your life is a lot easier. So what I see with younger kids is they're trying so hard to command the ball outside the strike zone that their mechanics falter. They start doing body movements to try to create these angles that are going to execute off the plate, and so they never develop. They become that pitcher on the left, and so everything spins the same way because they've been chasing particularly command out of the zone, particularly the 1 ball off, 2 ball off. That's a very common thing at the travel ball level. Command has a lot. I always say to my kids, I'm like, look, if you've got a good arm slot and you got good mechanics, like command is really easy. It's actually not that hard. It's much easier than baseball. If you think about baseball, they're out here in like a no man's land. There's no reference point where their arm is. So they'll oftentimes get outside their slot and not know it, and that's where the video comes in for them. With softball, it's like your body is in position to where you should know where your arm is every single time. Like a lot of us make a brief contact on the side, and so there's a reference point. So if command is an issue, it's almost always a mechanics issue, or they're chasing the wrong thing. They're trying to throw a curveball, which Nate said earlier, doesn't actually curve, but they're trying to make it curve, so they're throwing it off the plate outside. If they knew their curveball works because it has vertical component, it's like, okay, attack that down the middle, and then we start getting more consistent mechanics that way.
Okay, let's go to the next slide.
Cool. Okay, so we've talked about 4 different cool philosophies in pitching that you can use. And so now the question is, how do you use it back to our original cycle in recruiting, in player development, and then to win a ball game management, right? So we're gonna focus on recruiting for a second. So you guys as coaches, we hear this over and over again, I don't have enough time when I'm out recruiting to go look at all the kids that I want to see, right? You guys have super limited time, it's so valuable, and it's the biggest bottleneck that you guys have in your whole process. And so the more efficient you can be at looking at kids that will fit your program, that are worth your time to recruit, the better, right? So now,
when you say verifiable data, what does that mean?
So verifiable data is data that you can trust to make informed decisions off of, right? You guys are very good at asking good questions about coming to good conclusions, but if you're making conclusions on bad data, then you're not going to get the right answers. So the data has to be good in order for you to get good answers.
And when you do your job, you have 3 people plus 8 to 10 seasonals right now with you. How hard is the work of verifying data in process to make sure it's verifiable?
It's a slog. It's really important, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. You have to build a whole pipeline in order to do it well, and we'll get to that here at the end of the presentation. But if the building blocks aren't correct, then again, bad data, garbage in, garbage out, you're going to be making decisions on bad data, and there's no decisions are going to be correct if the data is incorrect. So it comes down to things like getting it tagged properly, cleaning it, having a sample size large enough that you can actually make correct statistical decisions, all of that. So again, there's tons of bricks in the foundation you have to lay first, and then you can start doing the cool analytics on top of it.
Hand it over to Nate for a second. Nate, you're running how many pieces of equipment for Major League Baseball, South Dominican, Venezuela, Colombia?
We have 12 stadium units in DR, Venezuela, and Colombia, and then 4 portables.
How valuable is that data to upstairs?
Extremely.
What was the value of players signed on that date, just the data, last year?
150 million.
Why? Why did they make decisions based on data?
Because they just
had. Did you clean it? Did you filter it? Did you verify it?
Oh yeah, I mean you can't have a data service unless you do that. So it's that'd be catastrophic if that didn't happen. But part of.
Where are we as a softball world in regards to this? If you took us and said, "Here's baseball, here's softball," where are we?
Well, I mean, it's on the player acquisition or player evaluation side. I would say softball is significantly further behind baseball on that. I would say in the development side, it's starting to catch up a little bit. Like, you're starting to see a lot more people use data and tech to kind of leverage
Does it win more ball games?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
seriously, Nate, you can't be telling me, look at this room. There's not hardly any seats filled right now. Some of these coaches want to win. Are they going to win more ball games if they use data to manage their team?
Oh, yeah, 100%.
Why do you think that? Is it because Major League Baseball told you?
No, I mean, it's because you're getting a more in-depth process of how to, extract, to leverage certain part of your organization, right? And you're just getting another unbiased, piece of information that can help you drive better decisions to that.
So when you look at what Mo's built here in this standpoint, do you agree with that concept that you look at your roster and say, what are you good at fixing? Will the data help me?
Yeah, because you in a competitive player acquisition world, which is every sport, today, you're not going to get your A players all the time. And so you have to figure out how to make A players out of, B, C level recruits, especially when you are only tasked with doing it within 12 scholarships. Just like the Rays have to make a competitive team with 65 million, and their competition is 180, 200, 220, $250 million payrolls.
Okay, throw it over to Josh for a second and just say, if you took Mo's comment there, what are you good at fixing? What are you good at fixing, Josh? What is your staff good at fixing? Have you decided that that's what you recruit to?
We have decided that that's what we recruit to, but I mean, what we're good at fixing is we're all good at variable different things. We talk about that 6 tool a lot, which factors in, but when you're talking about the video-based verifiable data that you're getting, you can actually build confidence through it with your players as well. I'm good at building confidence, so to speak, or belief. We systematically build it over a period of time, but the data actually helps me with that. And when you bring a player in that already has verified data to match.
Why? Were you a data person 24 months ago?
No, I was old school.
What's old school?
But believe what I see.
And your eyes are good? You're really good? You've trained eyes? You've been at it a long time?
I thought I was, but when you look at pitching specifically, in regards to what you see, I mean, and it's offensive too. I mean, you see a really pretty swing that can't hit the broadside of a barn. I don't know if you've coached that kid, but you've also seen a kid that it really is ugly, but they find barrel every time. This data tells you why and helps you helps you get them even better at what they do or don't do. Regard plane efficiency and all the things that you would talk about on the offensive side. On the pitching side, I mean, you said it best when you say you really can't see that vertical component or that you can't. You think you see it, so what you really see is velocity and whether that will win or will not win for you. And I think we're coming into an age now to where I'm just being honest, you either adapt or you die to a certain extent for us old school people, to where you're building staffs now based on data on what they do well versus what hitters are doing well, and then you go back to the timing piece of it, and ultimately when you get through with all the mechanical breakdowns and all those things, you're talking about hitting is timing and rhythm to a contact point or to a perceived contact point, and then pitching ultimately is disruption of timing. And when you're talking about velocity versus the off speed with the data, you're trying to disrupt time, and we have more vertical break or vertical movement to your pitch, you're ultimately disrupting timing.
Okay, so I'm going to go to the last concept on Mo's screen here and let her answer. What in the world is longitudinal data? I mean, to a layman, not to you.
Sure.
You're a mathematician. Talk to me.
Longitudinal data just means data collected over time and compared over time. So
I go to one of these colleges and they bring out a notebook full of Excel captured spreadsheets from camps. Is that longitudinal data over time?
So it is if they collected it, years ago, and then they keep using it. So that's the part that's really hard, is we see a lot of data collection processes where the data gets collected, but then it ends up in a binder somewhere and it never gets looked at again.
So why is it so important to have a third party like you or KJ or Prospect Wire or Baseball Cloud or someone else that keeps data over time?
So you can start to see trends across what plays and what doesn't. And then you can start using what we call a like model in your own recruiting. So if you have a player that performed really well 2 seasons ago, and you need to fill a slot in your roster with someone that looks like that player, you have her data now to be able to say, I need to find someone with component X, Y, and Z in my recruiting, and you can actually go do that. But if you don't store the data, if you don't keep it, it just gets lost, and then you can't go find this kid.
Okay, Nate, who has this data in Major League Baseball? Could I call the Astros right now and they got it? Or is it Major League Baseball's got it? Or does Texas A&M have it?
I can't tell you which teams, but pretty much the whole league is using.
How about the colleges? Do they have it?
In baseball or
in
something?
Baseball. Do they have and use data?
Yeah, there's a significant amount of TrackMans in college baseball.
They're collecting it?
Yeah,
they're storing it longitudinally?
No,
they're making decisions off of it?
For their own team, yes.
Okay.
Not in the recruiting market.
So baseball's evolving too, is the point I'm trying to make to you, in that the majority of the value is owned by one group of people, Major League Baseball. And what's happening at the winter meetings right now over the use of data in their contract negotiations?
It's, there's a lot of contract negotiations revolving data vendors and scouting packets.
Who owns the data? Does the individual own the data? Or does the team own the data? Now.
The company owns the data.
Really? Yeah. And they're negotiating on factors about me, in my compensation, without me even knowing what the data means?
Yeah.
Okay. So we just came through NIL. You think that'll go anywhere?
Potentially. I mean, I'm not an NIL expert, but
But I mean, we own our name, image, and likeness. Do we own our data?
Well, that depends on what the data is, because they're technically taking data of the ball, not the person.
Okay.
So
I want you to hear, because this is the platform we're moving into. If we either lead and set our own terms for how data is acquired or used or managed in women's sports, it would be one of the greatest things that ever happened over the male sport model, where they have to fight their way back in to get their own data. And so I would urge us to stay front and center with data knowledge, data possession being a right of the player as well as the franchise. So, okay, go ahead and go, Mo.
Okay. All right. So we've talked about using pitching analytics to help you recruit. Now we're going to talk about that in a little bit more depth, right? So we've talked about concepts like vertical stacking and velocity stacking and just plain velo and command. At the end of the day, we want to accomplish basically one of these two things. One is the swing and miss.
So let's break it there and grab one of our pitching coaches.
Sure.
Okay, that swing and miss, rise velocity, change up, vertical separation, ground balls, pop. Tell me what that means to you, Ryker.
I think swing and miss is pretty clear. But I think probably the next bullet point there with rise and velocity is that's a really rare characteristic, as Nate said. Most people who are somewhere underneath the ball, somewhere between 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock, that is usually of lower velocity. So that's a really rare category. I think great changeups are hard to come by. Vertical separation, being a kid who could go up
Stop there.
and down.
What do you mean great changeups are hard to come by? I watch ball game after ball game. What is a great changeup?
I think some things that make a great changeup are probably the velocity separation. So somewhere Nate said between 8 and 12 mile an hour is a good range. And then probably someone who can blend it. Like, can you blend, if you are majority drop, can you blend a topspin changeup with a drop ball? I think if you can blend any sort of off-speed pitch with a hard pitch that you have, that's really good for you.
So they look
Yeah.
similar?
Ideally, they spin exactly the same at two different speeds.
Okay.
Yep. And then vertical separation, obviously anyone who can go, I'm looking for those kids. So if there's any travel ball coaches in the room, you got a kid that's got real up and down and a change up, holler at me later. But obviously those are just rare and those are unicorns. So as I'm gunning for those kids, so is Oklahoma and UCLA. So, and then next level down from that, just ground balls. So that would be going into, do you have a kid who has great topspin? Like she has that 10-inch drop ball and she's continuing to produce ground balls. You know that plays a role.
10-inch.
Yep.
8, 6, 4, what? Why 10?
8 to 10. I would say 8 to 10 puts you in elite category. We know that now from people like OnDeck and Nate who are collecting a lot of data from young recruits, from college softball players that know that range of 8 to 10 or plus of that is what is playing in our game, is what is getting out. So then you have a kid who, okay, that's playing a role. You have somebody who's producing ground balls. On the other side, pop-ups, probably somebody with like horizontal or upspin. So again, there's a place for that as well.
Okay.
All right. So moving on from recruiting, now we can talk about actually developing your own roster, right? You've just spent all this time and effort to recruit your staff. Now, how do you make them better? How do you do a couple of things? One, make their strongest attributes even stronger, dominant, and not, as everyone on the panelists has been saying, not make them average across the board, not try to fix something and then make their strongest suit less effective. And then how do you, again, work within your staff to build the diversity, right? So in order to do this, you have to create a testing cycle, right? So you test one time just to get a baseline on all your players so you know what they look like, what their profiles look like, what is their strongest attribute, what is their B, class pitch, what is a pitch that they shouldn't be throwing anymore. And then from that, you can make those decisions by comparing to norms. So if you don't know what the norms are within your division, you're not going to be able to know what's elite and what's not, right? So you get norms and you're able to compare your kids to the norms and actually make those decisions. So once you've done that comparison, then you create the development plan. This is the part where your coaching expertise absolutely comes into play. You have to be able to translate essentially what's good, what's bad, what's working, what's not, into what you're going to fix, what you're going to develop to be elite, what you're going to just maintain, whatever it is. Create your development plan. That's great. What's really hard with the development plan, though, this is something that Nate speaks to a lot, is that you as a coach never have enough time to fix something as you'd like, right? Your hours are so limited to work with a pitcher that you have to be very conscientious about what you choose to fix and what you don't. There might be absolutely some things that you wish you could fix, but you can't. Or this is something, a low-hanging fruit. I know I have enough time, enough hours to fix this. I know I can do it, so that's what we're going to focus on, right? So you build your development plan. Then you work on the fixes, right? That can take months. It's not going to be in a day or two. And then you retest, and then you can see if you've made improvements based upon your development plan, right? So this whole cycle of testing is really important when you're trying to develop your own team.
Jump to your next one.
Okay. So then third piece is game management, right? Now we're trying to win ball games. Going back to our case study, though, with the Candidate Cup, if you want to have a diverse staff that has lots of different looks, if you don't recruit to that, if you don't develop to that, it's not going to be there for you when you try to win your ball game. If you recruit 5 kids that all have exactly the same movement profile, you're not going to have the diverse pitching staff to help you win the ball game, right? So at the end of the day, going back to our original cycle, the recruiting piece, the player development piece, it shows its head here on whether you've done your due diligence and all those other aspects. And then you can start, again, focusing on things like pitcher-hitter matchups. You can focus on minimizing the times through the order penalty. You can understand that, hey, we are in the middle of our season and my pitcher is really tired after this long road trip and she's very fatigued. I can't expect her to throw the same number of batters as she would when she's fully rested. All of those kinds of decisions you can start making. But the other 2 pieces, the recruiting and the player development, have to be there to support it.
Okay.
Cool. So, we've talked about this several times.
Let me grab Dana on this one. Complementing pitchers. And then Nate, you go with it next. What does that mean?
I mean, to use the word we've been using, diversity, like you want different movement profiles. So, I was a hard up rise ball pitcher. So if I'm going to be the first person going against a lineup, then the next person probably needs to be somebody with some sink and some different speed, right? It's a different look. They're going to have to adjust to it. Hitters don't like to have to adjust from at-bat to a completely different movement profile look. So if somebody's coming after me, like let's say I had a 4-inch rise ball, and I can throw the ball 65 to 68, and then you put somebody after me who throws the ball 62 to 64, and they have a 3-inch rise ball or 2-inch rise ball, you just made the job easier for the hitters, right? It's an easier adjustment, or vice versa, going the other way to some extent. So you want to make them uncomfortable with how they look at their at bat, right? And they don't want to go from up hard and then say soft down or an off speed. That's a big transition for them. So that's what, like speaking to your point, if you have, and we see it from time to time in college programs, if you're like really geared towards that hard throwing bullet spin pitcher and you've got 4 of those and one fails, you're just hoping and praying the next one is going to be more successful because their command. Is
that still fairly common to go see a lineup that throws, I like this and I like it a lot?
Hugely common, because I think we all want velocity, we all want up, like we all drift in kind of the same direction, and it's like we're comfortable with that. Or I see a lot of pitching coaches who, what they did, they're comfortable with. They recruit to what they know and how to coach. And kind of touching on the last slide, like you can't fix people, you can't fix pitchers in the time that you have. So I see a lot of coaches that will recruit somebody and be like, oh, I'll get her and then I'll fix that and then she'll be great, and you end up with the same pitcher because you couldn't fix it. Like you don't have enough time in a college off-season, fall season to change a lot of things. So if you can find the unique quality that you can just build that out and not have to fix their drag or not have to fix their arm circle or not have to fix their timing, like these are giant fixes. You have a very short amount of time, and their movement profile in their body might be preventing you from doing any of that, right? That might be well outside your skill set and your drill set to even fix. But I think that's why people end up with the same pitcher. It's like, oh, if I get this kid who's throwing 62 and I fix her drag, she's going to throw 69. But she ends up throwing 63 with the same movement profile as your kid who's throwing 64. I think we're human beings, and we like patterns and we like familiarity, and we all kind of fall into that same routine.
Nate, if you took the Canada Cup situation, how diverse were they, and were they complementing diversity?
Oh yeah, they were extremely diverse. You had pitcher, lefties, righties, up, down, change of different velo levels. Certain pitchers were good against righties, certain pitchers were good against lefties, certain pitchers were good against fly ball hitters, ground ball hitters. So you were checking a lot of boxes for sure.
So the example that I saw is the management of the Japanese roster against our roster has been complementing pitchers with loads of diversity, positioned in for totally different looks, and not a ride the horse. How are there horses out there that you can ride the 7 at an elite level right now?
Yes, but they're very hard to find, and so you're gonna have to have, like, as Ryker mentioned, like, up down change, at a high velo level, and then a plus, ability to command the ball. And so those are just, in any normal distribution of talent, those are just very difficult to find. And it's just not a good method to plan for actually finding that when the majority of your talent that you're recruiting from are kind of in that middle range.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to questions right now. We're near the end of our time slots. So if you want to come, we have a mic in the middle. We have a few more slides we can relate to. Are there any concepts left in there that you really want to share, Mo, that are real critical before we run out of our time allotment here?
So the one big one that I'll summarize is that data pipeline that we've talked about a couple of times. So to me, there's 3 main pieces to a pipeline. The first one is collecting the data. And I know that sounds benign, but it's actually super complicated. One, you have to collect it consistently every single time. So you guys see that when you're dealing with recruits. You'll have one kid who sends you numbers from a pocket radar. You'll have another kid that sends you numbers from a Rapsodo. You have another kid that sends you numbers from FlightScope. And your question is, can I compare these? And the answer is honestly no. It's not apples to apples. So when you're collecting data within your own program, it has to be done with the same tech, with the same protocols every single time, and then you have apples to apples data that you can legitimately start comparing stuff to. The second piece in that collection is just labeling it, tagging it. If you can do things like say just these are the pitch types.
Do you think that these people can find scribes or to start tagging some of their data? Is there a way, just like they got an assistant trainer or a bullpen catcher or a GA in charge of data tagging? How important is this?
Completely. If you mistag your pitches, then this pitch chart is not going to be functional for you. There is some nerdy math kid in the math department who wants to come work with you and help you do this. I promise.
When we reached out to get interns to come work for us, and Mo said it probably is not easy to do, to get people to nerd out and come in and crunch and screen up and clear outliers and clean data. How hard was it to find them?
Easier than I thought, yeah.
Oh, and from big time schools?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And maybe from your school, there's people that would nerd out and tag data and get you a good pipeline going. So I would say that the component of scaling your data capture is doable if you just think outside the box a little. There are people that like this a ton. Look at Mo. She caught for me. She likes this a ton, to capture and tag data, okay?
So it's tedious and it's time consuming, so it is probably not as a coach, the best use of your time, but there is somebody in your world who will gladly help you do this. But the cleaning piece is really important. So there's even Rapsodo, who we use at CSE, every time we collect pitches, we have to clean it and throw out pitches that, this kid has, say, total spin of 800, 900, 800, 900, and then there's suddenly a 1400 RPM that comes in. You can see that it's bad data. You have to chuck it, right? If you don't clean it and you keep it, Now when you start doing averages across all those numbers, it's again, garbage in, garbage out, right? So the cleaning part is really important. And again, there's absolutely kids around in your world who want to help you do that.
Okay, I'm gonna let Nate wrap a little bit from his side. Where are we gonna be in 3 years? Are we gonna be sitting in a room like this, or are we gonna be sitting in a room like this with just the people winning conferences that are managing? What do you see coming? Because I have a definite opinion. Meaning I was capable of using your tools with you and putting together a roster of kids that were left over. And other than my own mistakes, probably should have been 3 wins against the U.S. national team. By using this methodology of capturing data and being able to see excess value, surplus value in kids that maybe didn't even get picked by our national team, one of the best systems around. So you have that same model. So Nate, where the hell are we going here? What's going to happen? Because Derek and I are going to age out here somewhere. You know?
I think the 2 major advancements in the sports will be in-game data. So being able to use that, both.
When you say in-game data, tell me what that is.
Collecting data in a competitive game. So right now a lot of the data collection is done, in practice, privately, in testing sessions. But I think being able to get that same information while the lights are on and in a competitive situation is going to be a big step forward for the sport. And then number 2 is kind of what I categorize as like digital scouting. Is going to, I think, be a lot more prevalent in the recruiting aspect. Just from, I know there's a lot of talk on this conference about how much coaches should recruit, how many looks you can actually get of a player, and so the ability to have multiple eyes in the sky of filtering through players will be kind of a big next progression going forward without actually having to be there.
Kick it over to Josh. Where are we going, Josh? Your synopsis.
Well, I mean, like Nate just said, I mean, a lot of conversations about recruiting calendars and those types of things. Data is going to become very valuable to how you identify and be more efficient with your time during the time that you have. With all the talks of, mental health and all these things, you have to make sure that you understand the data in order to actually really be able to recruit efficiently moving forward, and that's the way it's heading, in my opinion.
Okay, right.
What I would like to see, and I don't know if we're headed there, but what I would really like to see, I think, from a pitching coach perspective in recruiting is just that we start to see less of these rankings, less of these, I think she's number 5, I think she's number 10, based off what some travel coach said or somebody said. And I would like to start to see more of a ranking system from data and from ball flight. I tell kids all the time, like when they come to camp, which I gather data on every kid that comes to my campus, but I tell kids all the time, like, if you want to catch my attention, like, send me your ball flight data. Like, it's better for me as a college coach if I can know.
Send me your ball flight data?
Yeah.
You're asking them, are you turning anybody down that doesn't send it to you?
No, because then I wouldn't have
Will
anybody
you?
probably. But no, I mean, I am asking them that. I'm asking when they go to OnDeck, when they use Rapsodo, when they do those things, like, and they're getting that data, like, send that to me. Like, I want to see that, and I think it does a better job for me as a college coach. I'm going out recruiting. I'm saying, okay, like, I need drop. Okay, so like I'm losing my drop baller, like I need another down baller, like how do I go and how do I get that? What are those kids? Where are they? Instead of showing up at the 50 random fields.
What are you going to do to live in this world in 3 years, you yourself personally in data? Are you going to change any of your behaviors?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always trying to grow and evolve. I try to surround myself with people that are smarter than I am and continue to learn from them. And I want to continue to learn more about data, ways that you can use it. I think that where our game is definitely going is the in-game data collection. I would like to see that. I think sometimes we all know from a pitching perspective, what you can produce in a bullpen is very different from what you can produce on the mound when the lights come on. So we'd definitely love to see more in-game data and start to dig more into that.
Okay, Dana?
I think the data is going to lead us to a direction of talking about volumes and pitch management, because I think that if we have in-game data, we're going to start tracking pitchers, and we're going to see when the trending is down, when velocity is trending down, our spin direction is trending down, our spin efficiency, and down to the youth levels, right? Like, we're not developing pitchers at the rate at the youth level we could because they're throwing too much and they can't maintain. This is something that's huge in baseball. Like, there's a front office that's alerting the dugout, when a trending of a pitcher has dropped dramatically and now he's got a dead arm and they're pulling him out of a game in that inning, right? There's correlation to the number of pitches per inning and the quality of the pitch that's coming out from the data. So I think we're going in that direction, coupled with the recruiting calendar, where we start really asking ourselves in 3 years' time how beneficial it is that a 15-year-old has thrown 185 innings in a year. Like, what is that doing to their development and their numbers? Because if they know their numbers and they know they're trending down, that's going to change their motivation. So I hope we get on the same language. I hope that we all start understanding upspin, downspin, spin efficiency. We've all accepted spin rates, you know, when RevFire came out however many years ago, we got obsessed with spin rates. I think we need to expand our language, and we all can kind of get on Nate's page a little bit and blend the data with the pitching minds, and so it's consistent, right? And then it's consistent to the youth player. And now when parents are hiring pitching coaches to coach their kid, if we're not talking about data and we're not talking about ball flight data, and you're going somebody to teach you how to throw a rise ball, but they can't tell you what the spin efficiency of a rise ball is, then we're going to go somewhere else, right? I think consistency across the board on all levels.
Okay. KJ?
Yeah, I agree. Dealing with a lot of youth players, they rely on their pitching coaches so often, but what are they doing to understand what they're doing? How can someone just sitting there watching say, you need to do this to change it? And I think that really affects it. And you know, especially when they're playing all these games, like Dana said, it's just going to affect them. And that's why so many pitchers get hurt their sophomore, junior year of college. And yeah, they're throwing way too much. So I'm a big fan of data all around the board.
3 years, I'm just hoping to be hanging out with you guys still. That's my goal. Yeah, I mean, you guys are the best. Softball's the best world out there. So I'm just hoping I'm hanging with you.
Thank you, Derek. Mo, final thoughts on this project's now lasted, we're 31 months old. We're just a baby in this space. Derek and KJ have been at it longer, the coaches have been at it longer, but the evolution, what's your thoughts on what you're seeing? What will we look like in 3 years, according to you, Mo, in data capture and use of data?
So as a company, we are collecting all this data on college athletes so that we can accurately predict what the youth athletes are actually doing, where they could play today. That's the underlying reason why we're doing all of this. And so I want to be able to say with extreme accuracy, this kid could play at a D2 level successfully well because she checks all these boxes, because she matches that same profile of a, say, D2 pitcher, because we've done our homework and we've built the math behind it to do it accurately and correctly. Because at the end of the day, everyone wins in that scenario. You as the coach know, okay, that's a player that could play for me and would play, would fit in. And then the player can then also focus on those schools and not be, talking to schools that aren't appropriate for them. So at the end of the day, the data can be really powerful, and you can start to match up that youth athlete with the college athlete, and everyone just has a better experience with a better fit.
Okay, if there's no additional questions, then we got one over here.
Going back to cleaning up data.
Yeah.
So if you're pitching, and let's just say, the one you gave was an obvious one, but let's just say they're drop ball, right? So let's just say they're a 10 o'clock spin on most of them, but you actually get that one that's really good, and you get that 12-6 spin, that drop spin that you want. But that's the outlier here. That's what you want. Is that something you would throw away because that's not consistent, because everything's sort of been, or how do you then take?
Who wants to take that question?
I mean, if it's in a reasonable range, then yeah, I mean, obviously you can. I personally evaluate pitchers of what they do most consistently, not necessarily the peaks of which they can do, especially in a small sample size scenario like a showcase or testing environment. So, but I would leave it in on a report if it's a reasonable, increase off of their median cluster, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Question over here.
The median is really important in all of this. So if you have a pitcher throw enough pitches you look at the median velocity, you look at the median break, that's gonna best classify what that pitcher is doing most of the time. If you look at the maxes or the mins, you're not doing yourself many favors. Yeah.
Right, so that would be the value of like high-speed camera, of something like Insight or Sony camera, or even your iPhone, as Dana's referring to, is like, what does the arm and the hand look like when that should be happening for you to verify, okay, is this real or is it not? Now, it's probably going to be very rare that she's producing something like straight bullet and then she's just going to pop out some top spin and then go straight back into bullet. So it probably have to be something that you would continue to see, like, okay, you've seen it, now as it continuing to develop, now let's look, is that actually even look any different from the way the ball's actually being delivered out of the hand?
Question over here.
Yeah, so I'm coming from a slightly different perspective. I'm a high school coach, so preferably from one of the pitching coaches or both. Freshman coming in, what would be the best predictor of long-term success for my program as far as finding a grow who has some natural velocity but struggles with the vertical stack and command, or finding grow who has some natural vertical stack and just trying to develop velocity over time? What would be the number one trait that you would try and identify trying to develop?
Number one, that's hard. I think one of probably my detriments is like, I think that everybody can be good. And I think there's like a lot of ways to do it. So I think like when you look around our game, period, college level, doesn't matter. Like there are a lot of different pitchers that are good for different reasons. So kind of like what I'm speaking on Saturday is a little bit of like taking people from where they are to where you want them to go. So like assessing what they have. We all have something. We are all naturally set up to be better at something, whether it's velocity, whether it's spin, one up, spin direction versus the other, up versus down. So assessing what they have and then how you can continue to develop that. I think you can win a lot of games with one good hard pitch and a changeup. So I would try to take what they have, whether that's okay, is it bullet, is it upspin, is it downspin, and then try to get a changeup off of that. I think especially at the high school level, you could be really effective with that.
Okay, guys, we got a wrap. They got another group coming in. Oh, got one here I missed. Or one more. Okay, Diane's giving me a green light. One more.
One more for Dana. So we're talking about in-game data and what they're kind of assessing already, but biomechanically, is there something you found that's been significant to you that's a predictor of success or failure, or even recruiting-wise, what should be a red flag or a possible predictor of future injury? We also say, it's easier to go someone who's already up to go down now, rather. Is that something that you look for from a biomechanical perspective when you're assessing pitchers?
Yeah, so there's no real way to predict injury, but we have some ideas that we're working through. Understanding where your pitcher's limitations are. I spoke about ranges of motion, right? Like athletes that are super. It's common that I get college coaches that say to me, "I'm shocked that you're more concerned about the hypermobile athlete than the less mobile athlete." I'm like, every single day of the week, I'm stressed about the hypermobile athlete. They don't own their range of motion; they get into it passively. So that's like a concern for me. Like, can they control it? Like, momentum's a huge factor when the body gets moving. Like, they don't always have control of what they're doing. Like, if an athlete has a big gap from passive to active ranges of motion, that's a yellow flag, right? They don't own that. Some of the stuff we're looking at right now, it's kind of like out there in left field. I try to be a little bit bizarre in my approaches. Is like how wide the rib cage is and how narrow the rib cage is and how that determines your ability to lay back your arm into slot. I think that our physical structure and how we develop into is dictating the direction that we can take a ball into. I think we're going to start connecting some dots on that. It is easier, I think, to take an athlete from down to up, because when you're talking about up, you're talking about laying back an arm longer. The arm wants to unravel. The sequence wants to let the rotation happen and jump from one body part to the next in terms of acceleration. So when you get somebody who can throw a really good rise ball, they tend to delay that sequence, and that's really impressive in terms of motor control and strength. It's more common to see down because it's easier to unravel that arm early, and now you're getting behind the ball. So I'm more curious about the kids that can stay in that slot, and why is it that they can stay there? Is it a joint position? Is it a strength issue? Is it a mobility? Like any one of those questions. Yeah, so it's super complicated, but we have some working theories.
Okay, guys, thank you. We're out of time.